this understanding that the four of us really get that we are not separate from the natural world. We're completely interdependent. Cool. Got it. Up here, how do I make it available to the substance of who I am so that it guides the way that I behave from day to day, and I don't default as easily as I probably still do into separation thinking, into we they thinking, into I'm separate from you and I've got to make my case. Yeah.
The pedosphere, as in
Yes.
Greek pedon, I think for soil or ground, as I understood it. Yeah. And that pedosphere name, as you both know, is one of the systems that the Gaia principle, which Lovelock had the good fortune of Lynn Margulis coming in and really putting some of the biology and the microbiology together to sort of come up with this theory. But it seems to be, in fact, quite true that all of these different systems exchange with each other. In fact, it just I like it metaphorically because it keeps reminding me that in the world, for it to be sustainable salinity, sustainable temperature, even though the sun's gone up 30% in heat in the last 3 billion years, a sustainable atmosphere generally, that's all these things playing together, and you can't, as an individual life form, you have no chance to be there if you're not also in relationship with the community. Giving and taking from the community, each individual plant, each individual component of the
Yeah.
soil. There's just these adjustments to achieve this homeostasis that's not, perfect. It's not a flat line, but it's remarkable how long conditions have remained, it's relatively stable as they have, especially with the sun.
And
Because
this is really, you're talking about the Gaia theory and principle
Mhm.
and what has been observed within that context. You take it down to any individual ecology and you've got the same thing going on.
Yeah.
And if you take it even down to, I think I mentioned this in that update, I'm not sure, maybe that I sent fifth graders out with hula hoops and had them, yes. I mean, that was just, and this was like dirt. And they found so much. It was so exciting. So you take it down even that far and you even farther. So, Jacqueline, you've been walking around and looking at this stuff for your entire career. And Dan, you're preparing for this talk. I'm thinking also, Dan, that there's all these and anticipating what we call psychology or any of the social sciences are, I might suggest, all the spiritual traditions, which have been about our understanding that we are fundamentally interdependent. And the earth, of course, comes into all of those. I would bet every one of those traditions. I'm not sure.
Mm.
So it's not as if we haven't had organically informed, earth, soil informed notions of how to proceed as humans, but we've moved away from it. So my question to you two is, in your work in the field, Jacqueline, and in your work, Dan, and investigation, have you had experiences that got you so deeply that really did change the way you perceive other people and the way you interact?
Or see your own sense of place in the world.
You first, Jacqueline.
Oh, um, I have to ponder that for a while.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I wondered, what about you?
Um, I don't know. The more we continue to go on, and every kind of earth science, life science continues to reach additional conclusions about the interconnectedness of everything, as these ancient religions said was true. It's an ongoing changing of my life because I can't live consciously in the midst of that level of interconnection right down to the microbiome in our gut without really starting to kind of understand that I'm dancing in this rhythm of exchanges and not not just this isolated person that ends at the end of their skin. So it's been an awakening more than a one single aha, I
Hmm.
get it moment for me.
Yeah, I really, I think this is a challenging question for me too. You know, can I point to a moment as an example of this sort of thing? What I can say is that I can see uh, sometimes it's almost horrifying the levels of um, conditioning and socialization, the way that my whatever this sense, and it's the mentally mediated sense of who I am and how I am to survive and how I am to comport myself socially, how those things and who you can trust and who you can't trust, what you can trust and what you can't trust. Um, it's it's amazing to me how deep that goes. And it has, as you were just, it seems like alluding to, pretty much zero to do with the truth of this form and how it all by itself functions in absolute and intricate and kind of sublime um, interconnection. The form itself,
Yeah,
you
yeah.
know, so what's up with the mind taking this wrong turn?
And I wonder if kind of a centered place to be as a human being is represented by that whole notion globally of homeostasis. You know, it's not just the Earth that does this, but all kinds of individual, of course, ecologies on the Earth. And you know, as a species, what would that even mean, homeostasis? What are we to keep stability, to keep our center, to keep from having to, you know, deal with things that release massive volumes of cortisol and shorten our lives. I mean, if homeostasis means health and longevity, what does that look like? What do our actions look like to support that?
And what do our mentations, what does our cognitive
Absolutely. Yeah,
activity look like?
absolutely. Yeah.
And you know, I guess the thing that we spoke about in the last retreat, that was really, we got some powerful places in that retreat, but um was what hmm, what stories are you telling? And how absolutely devoted are you to those stories? You know, and for me, a good place to look for that for sort of an acid test is what stories am I telling about the current federal administration? All my separation stuff comes up. You know, it's just right there. And I'm not saying that thinking that cognition is bad. It is not. It's just that we have structured our cultures so that the heart has been placed in service to the mind. And that's always been backwards. The mind is a great tool. The ego is a great tool in service to the heart. And so I suppose part of this question, starting with Earth, is what is it in the soil, in the planet itself, that busts up our stories of separation and invites us into really relaxing a lot and being humble and right-sized.
Yeah. I I mean, gosh, I love the notion of the what was marine life being able to finally come ashore, which gives you lots more photosynthesis if you're on land. But how are you going to get the nutrients you need? Making this marriage with the microbes in the dirt and certainly the mycelium networks and those two coming together, you know, giving life. It's just
Say a little more about that. Are you talking about the
the plant
plants
material that was
first?
in the ocean coming
Uh-huh.
on and establishing terrestrial, you know, versions of plants, depending on it depended entirely on, of course, the soil and the mycelium and those things that work the soil to allow the plants to, yeah, sure, they were going to get more photosynthesis opportunities, but it solved the problem of how do I How do I feed myself?
And then it created more complexity and specialization within the
Oh,
soil itself by
yes.
virtue of the
Right. Yeah.
interaction.
One complexity leads to a mirror complexity.
So that by the time the fish got feet and started walking out onto the planet, there was stuff for them to eat. It wasn't just back in the water. This is cool. Yeah. What are your thoughts?
Well, I was having fun thinking about the fungal mycelia and eventually associating with the plant roots as mycorrhizae, and just that's the same flow as the ocean currents bathing the plant life with nutrients in the water. So it's that
Yeah.
water earth connection that you all are referring to. They all are connected. Um, but yeah, I just, what keeps coming up for me today, Mary, is, on the one hand, I I totally agree that separation thinking is the problem, but on the other hand, having emerged from a family where boundaries and enmeshment were an issue, I I'm struggling with the both and of this, right? Like,
Hmm.
we are interdependent and interconnected, and still we have to find ways to hold ourselves, at least in some ways, separate and not invade on when it comes to the social realm. And then I wonder whether there's an equivalent in the, I mean, there is, of course, an equivalent in the biological or ecological realm. I mean, their cells have walls, they
Yeah.
have to hold their stuff inside. There
Yeah.
are boundaries, there are borders that do have to be kept for functioning to happen.
Yes.
And so let's look at what you have seen in your work over time about soil and soil's interaction with the different components that make up soil and that within the notion of soil. But you can't take soil apart from the things that are interacting with it that are more what we would call organic. The soil itself is organic too, but say plant life. I don't have quite the language that you all do. But if you look at that, this is the word I want to say is sovereignty. You just said it. A cell, in order to function, in order to be a part of this absolute unified web, must have sovereignty. The cell has boundaries. The cell takes care of and within the cell, the mitochondria have boundaries. So what we have is a misguided notion of what sovereignty means. We equate sovereignty with rugged individualism, but in fact, sovereignty is what I've been referring to Jude Currivan's work in cosmology, what she suggests as the universe's experience of unity, complete unity in diversity. So diverse expression of the unity that is all of it. And in each of the diverse expressions, there is sovereignty. So that's a thing to play with. You know, you already gave a great example with a cell. Do you think of anything else with, you're kind of digging around in dirt?
Well, I can't say that it's something that I've particularly seen while digging in the dirt, but oaks and hickories are famously known for requiring mycorrhizal networks, the particular associations with fungi that help feed them. And so whenever I'm planting my oak and hickory seeds, I always collect some soil from around oak and hickory trees and inoculate
Hmm.
my seedlings. Just, put a teaspoon of that soil. I don't know that I'm actually capturing the the fungal spores, the fungal pieces, but I'm
Yeah.
hopeful that I
Yeah.
am. Um, but but the more earthy example is I collect my acorns and hickory nuts and I store them in moist sand and put them in cold storage over the winter. And when I pull those Ziploc bags out and open them, those fungal networks have often already started. And there is a particular and distinctive, sometimes almost overpowering smell of the, but not, I mean, it's like strong earthy mushroom,
Uh-huh,
Mm.
uh-huh, right.
sometimes. When I open those bags, those networks are already at work.
I love that. What a great image.
And so then taking that, the seed itself is sovereign. The seed is taking care of itself and doing what the seed does. And then the mycorrhizia or you say it different.
So mycorrhizae is how ecologists say it.
Okay.
Go for the fungus and rhizae for root.
Okay. So the mycorrhizae, I may screw that up again, but the mycorrhizae, it's like a tennis grip, you get the wrong tennis grip and it screws you up forever. Um, are each of those strands in some ways are sovereign. And in this case, sovereign means think just the tree itself. Think of the tree. The tree is not in competition with any of the other trees in any like way that we think of that. It's not like, yeah, I'm going to beat you out, or, I did put my leaves out better than you did this year. Then none of that. It's not, it's just doing its sovereign, beautiful thing. At the same time, part of its sovereignty is absolute acknowledgement of its complete interdependence with everything that's going on around it. And so I think part of what's trying to happen for what I tend to refer to as the recovery from the addiction to separation thinking, I think it is kind of an addiction, is that our awareness, our consciousness, the story we tell ourselves about who we are and what the world and the universe are, is being asked to shift so that it really is comfortable to us and most true to say, this is unity, this is unity, this is unity in diverse expression. And that the sovereignty is honored in that.
Yeah,
And that's where whacked out families are whacked out. Because there's incapacity standing on generation after generation and after generation. And there's probably not one non-whacked out family, frankly, given what it is that we've all been through with this deep socialization into separation.
well, I think something, Jacqueline, you said earlier, both and. That's it. It's both and. There are all kinds of protective mechanisms that separate a seed from its outside environment, an egg with,
Oh gosh,
a young growing bird in it separated. But at the same time, most of those separation, apparent visual boundaries have permeability to them as well. So some things come in, membranes of a cell, other things stay out. And maybe, so that's sort of in some ways when it comes to a family, yeah, what is it that's toxic that just we got to, not let the membrane pass it into our, egos, basically. I'm really mixing all kinds of metaphors here, but I think it is a both and approach that we don't have to choose. It's not a dualistic thinking um, situation.
No, it's really, but it is discernment, So in the current political situation, I elect not to be in interaction. And if it came up, I would, but I don't go seeking out interaction with people who are uh, enthusiastically in support of what seems destructive to me. Um, I guess just the ongoing wars, the raids in LA, you name it, the cuts to food stamps, on and on and on and on. And I don't choose to spend much time listing those to myself. And at the same time, I am working from my sovereign position to prime in my relationships and my interactions for as much of our evolution as I'm able. And I think that's why this full ecology thing is so helpful, because it is inviting us to see this is maybe part of what's confounding about this, Jacqueline, that when Eastern traditions started showing up in the 70s and 80s and stuff, by the time it got to be 90s, late 90s, I was aware of people saying non-duality. You got to be in non-duality. Everything's everything. And yes, that's really true. And that was the kind of ching, everything is everything. I'm you, you're me. I can see you in my eyes, that kind of nothing wrong with that, except for it rejects that duality is contained within non-duality. So there is duality. Our conditioned minds have a hard time getting that, have a hard time relaxing into that. Because in that situation, when I don't know how to speak to, like this wouldn't apply to a child in a harmful family situation, but to an adult child who has done a lot of investigation and work on this, really considering this, there is the possibility of just being very clear. I'm not going to participate in that, saying that. I would like to continue talking with you, and I might be willing to hear what you have to say, but not when you're talking to me that way. And so let's take a break and we'll get back together later. But that is a very sovereign statement. That is one that is, this is not even, I'm not going to let that happen to me anymore. So that is a kind of duality, and it's certainly a discernment in the context of this unity, which is everybody in the family is part of the family, or whatever, however we wish to construe that. I hope that's useful at all.
It is, and I keep going back to the metaphors around seeds and yeah, and and eggs having boundaries that are porous, but then also even within that boundary, they are part of their larger system. Like
Mm,
that egg's not
mm,
going to hatch unless it's warmed by a parent bird. And so even though it has its separateness, it's still part of something larger. And
mm.
I'm just going to apologize. I'm going to have to turn off camera and sound because I have to do an airport run. So I'm going to be listening in because I will be in the car the full rest of the time and
Okay.
going on, but I will just be listening. And now it's Dan's turn because I feel like I've just totally hogged this
Oh,
conversation.
So, my take on all this is I don't see a conflict at all with um, duality wrapped in oneness, because that's how it appears to be.
Mm, mm,
Um,
mm.
all of life evolves and creates, and to have that happen, we have to have sovereignty and boundaries and competition. It requires all of those things to function. And it is the function of all these individual parts that makes the strands of the web.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
every piece has to do its thing. And that combination of each piece doing its thing creates the oneness.
Well said. Yeah, yeah. So there is no real conflict. It's both and.
It is. And that's my take on it.
well, and so to illustrate that, you may not be this far down the road, but what kind of example from the plant world would you use to illustrate that to your listeners when you speak with them?
Okay. Let's talk about trees. We already have discussed their place with mycorrhizae, right? Their
Well
connection
done.
to the fungal world. They have to have soil. They have to have carbon dioxide.
Hmm.
They have to have mineral content.
Hmm.
We are required to have water to exist. So
Mm.
there's an interaction with the atmosphere and the climate. So all of these components are required for this one organism, let's say it's an oak tree, to do its thing.
Yeah.
While it is doing its thing, it is going to be evolving and drawing its own boundaries, both with the physical shell of the bark protecting it from pests, creating the chemical defenses against
Mhm.
certain insects and herbivory and things like that. It's going to outcompete other plants by shading them out intentionally so that it gets the sunlight and they do not.
Mhm.
So there's a lot of action that goes on for competition and self survival, but it requires every little piece that is in the whole system. Otherwise, it can't exist.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, work that backwards. For example, what is it about the tree? It sprouts and then it grows and it builds more and more, a thicker and wider and stronger trunk and branches and so on and so forth. What are the benefits to the soil, to the air, to the water of that tree being in
Ah,
that
yes.
system?
Okay. When that tree becomes successful, then it will be able to have what we call mutualism
Mm.
with other creatures. The oak tree in question is going to serve as a host plant for literally hundreds of just insect species. It's going to create food for tons of different animals. It's going to be housing for squirrels and birds, fungi. Inside the soil, the fungi and the plants have this relationship where the plants, through their photosynthesis, will feed the fungi because they have to eat. And the fungi can absorb minerals from the soil and feed the plant because the plant can't absorb those minerals without the help of the fungi. So
Yeah.
that's an easy mutualistic description. And then we can go to the atmosphere.
Hmm.
So, the trees, everybody knows with photosynthesis, it basically breathes in carbon dioxide, does its magic, and expels oxygen and water vapor in that. And so that is the primary way that the oxygen and carbon dioxide stays balanced in our atmosphere.
When then the leaves, when they fall from that
Exactly. Yeah. And then the leaves,
contribute
right?
to the soil. Yeah,
And
So
yeah,
there's
the leaf
carbon.
litter, while it's just sitting there and not really starting to decompose, is housing for lots and lots of different critters.
right,
Yeah.
And
right.
then it filters the water, goes into the soil. And
Hmm.
then as the decomposers start to do their magic, it's food for the decomposers. It's host for various insects and other critters that lay their eggs and nest in there. And eventually it starts to decompose into the humus, and then it decomposes more into soil, and
Yeah,
it puts back into the system what it has taken. This whole planet is a beautiful recycling system.
it is just
Yeah,
incredible,
it
isn't
is a
it?
recycling system.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
And a storage system for all kinds of things. I mean, the porosity of the soil is what allows like heavy rains to not move too quickly through the soil, but to be held there and then recharge the aquifers, which, so there's just the carbon stored in the soil is 3 times as much carbon as all the plants on Earth store. So it's just, yeah, yeah, there's that function too, but you're right. You can't pull one strand of the web out and not expect it to have effects on.
Yeah, the question we had on the table earlier that we got away from was, how do we as humans um, become right sized? How do we get where we are with our separation thinking? And how do we get back to being right sized?
yeah. And so I'm most curious right now with that last part. And so I was thinking in the kind of the vein that we were going with, looking both directions with the tree, multi directions, but what does the tree give back? One of the challenges I wonder about, and I'm curious what both of you think, and you too, Jacqueline, but you can't talk. Um, I'm curious what you think about the distance between me and the source of my dinner last night. I was thinking my dinner last night has had a role in my being here and my dinners for my entire life, my meals for my entire life, being here in this conversation right now. Those things, it's very easy for me to say, oh, yeah, I'm just getting. There's a point where people who are environmentally passionate have this like, oh my gosh, we're just like suckers. We just like sucked all the energy in. We're just taking it and taking it. And what do we do in return? And so I wonder about that distance, the what a say Anasazi person did in return, how it was closer to the way the tree gives back to the soil and the air, because there's less distance. And I think of an Anasazi person as an ancient indigenous uh, person who was part of a tradition and lived much closer, wasn't as separated as we are from seeing how we give back. Now, one thing I can say is that this conversation is part of the giving back. This conversation that asks, how can we understand that we are, in fact, in exchange and maybe up that? And that's the question that a lot of environmental activists have been asking.
Well, it's interesting, but when I was speaking with the Tewa Pueblo people down in New Mexico, and it seems like a lot of Pueblo cultures have this notion of there being a kind of duality. There's light, there's dark, and they describe the world in those pairs. But then they also say that for them, the path to their own realizing their capacity as individuals and as a culture lies in essentially the middle way and also finding and establishing as a human what they call, they're very big into the notion of continuity. So what was it that our ancestors found was essential to their living well on the earth that has been passed on through the generations to us? And how can we honor and also thrive based on the continuity of our own modern expression of those same qualities?
Well, so bring that back to, though, the humans giving back in the way that the tree gives back. Dan gave a great example when I said, well, so how do we turn that around from the big organism, not just sucking in resources from the outside world, but contributing back? What do you suppose?
Well, I mean, in some senses, we're a species that, gives off carbon dioxide when we exhale, and that's good for the trees. They can take it in. But you could get rid of humans and things would be just fine in most of the rest of the world. I would say that a lot of cultures believe that there's a kind of the essential notion of witnessing and honoring the other parts of the earth, basically. They're a part of it, but in bringing honor and ritual, the ritual of honoring all the components of the earth, that's a kind of witnessing that, depending on the religion, is part of what we satisfy as our giving to the earth. Now, how that philosophy or religion or sacred ritual actually literally gives, if you want to say energetically, to the earth, I don't think anybody knows if it does or how it does.
Certainly it
It's
does.
just it's a mysterious process that I think probably isn't meant to be fully unraveled, that it can really only be held in the notions of sacred and can't necessarily be parsed out and quantified the way Western science is so fond of insisting we do, like B.F. Skinner said, if we can't measure it, it doesn't exist. Yeah, not I'm not convinced about that.
Well, and so there are
So
people,
can I try to see if I can, I'm going to stop light. So I'm going to try and make a brief
okay,
comment, which is that one of the things I love about Robin Wall Kimmerer's book is how she talks about, she's done research on some of these plants that indigenous people have cultivated and harvested, and they actually did better during that time when they
our
were
plants.
being tended to by people than when the traditions fell away and they were no longer tended to and cared for. And a separate example coming from a very different place is in, Michael Pollan's wonderful Botany of Desire, where we like to
Mm.
think that we've developed all these plant varieties, but in fact you could look at it as the plants that have successfully cultivated their relationship with us have become
Ah,
Yes,
that's
extremely
yes,
successful.
beautiful.
right,
That's
right. Thank you,
beautiful.
Jacqueline.
Yeah, that's
Wonderful.
great.
Yeah.
Well, and current people in physics and in cosmology, not less surprising in cosmology, but in physics, are seeing that, are suggesting and standing on the Gaia principle
Mm.
that it would be hard on Gaia to lose humans, that there is this interdependence and this presence through and with each other that is part of this expression of increased complexity and increased specialization,
Mm.
that humans represent a step in that. And if you whacked out that species, it would be problematic and it would take Gaia a good while to recover and move forward in the next evolutionary step with humans functioning, especially if we remember who we are. And that's the right size part. Remember who we are. Just remember who and what we are and behave in that way. We are a part of this ongoing, we're conduits for the next evolutionary expressions, which are already showing up.
Yeah, and kind of dragging it down to what might one day be measurable again. I'm fascinated by the notion of quantum entanglement. Is there, for instance, there's quantum entanglement that allows the leaf to be as absolutely efficient as possible to have the capacity for routing that photon 1,000 different ways to the center of the cell, and only knowing in the instant it happens which way is best. Well, is it possible there could be some sort of entanglement with between humans and other species, and what would that look like? It's just again probably not entirely knowable, but it's part of the almost a sacred mystery. It gives me a way to play with the notion of the mystery.
Well, do you remember that elder from up in Alaska who was describing sitting as a young boy and watching the walrus hunters going
Mm,
along with the walrus hunters. And they would watch and watch and watch, and then they would go sleep. And then they would watch and watch and watch, and they would go sleep. And they would watch and watch and watch, and there would be a sign. And it would be a felt sign that the walrus were coming and they were going to be
mm,
able to.
mm.
So, and the other thing that he talked about was watching the birds, but that was different. So, this Jacqueline, what you're bringing forward, we mentioned this. You all may not have been at the deep dive where we mentioned this. We got back to this tiny space where we are. We can see the entire space from where we're standing right now. And there are plants here that a friend of mine took care of while we were gone. And when we got back, they were okay, but not great. And it is incredible how they are flourishing. It is kind of stunning.
Yeah.
So that seems to me consistent with that. But I don't need the science. I don't need the numbers.
Yeah. Well, they're
Measurement.
flourishing, and as are we by virtue of being
Thank
in their
you.
company.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a party.
Yeah. What else, Dan?
I think humans' place in the wheel is about caretaking and being a catalyst.
Mm,
Because as a species, we have um, not so great tools when it comes to claws and running speed and protection from the elements.
Yeah.
like some of the other creatures. But what we do have is a consciousness that appears to be a little bit more evolved than many. So that is the tool that we can use to start to give back as a catalyst when it
Mm.
comes to, you had mentioned honoring the spirits and tending to the plants and sort of assisting in helping to create some balance in the land. That is our original purpose. For a long time, we did that. And in the last few hundred years, we have really effed that up.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and societally, I think the separation has gotten to the point where, just like you were saying, Mary, people are born and live most of their lives completely disconnected from where their food comes from, how the weather might affect them and their bodies and their food and any interaction with the world is like completely voluntary. And
Mm.
Mm.
so
Mm.
the relationship is no longer there. We have to actively seek out the relationship in order to start reconnecting.
Yes.
It
Yeah.
used to be automatic
Hmm.
and you would die without it.
Hmm.
And nowadays in our modern society, it's just the opposite. You can live your entire life completely disconnected, and most people do.
Well, is it
Yeah.
completely disconnected or completely unaware that you are totally connected?
Yeah.
It's the second
Unaware.
thing,
Yeah,
right? The
unconscious. Yeah,
openness.
right. Okay, good.
You can
That's
have, when I say unconnected, I mean you can have zero relationship
Yeah.
from your side.
with
Yeah,
the natural world,
yeah,
um,
yeah.
just unaware.
And that completely empowers the dominance paradigm,
Yes.
the extraction paradigm, all of that, which
Right.
is just getting really tired. I just don't think it's going to last very much longer, but that's just the evidence I see.
We were talking this week earlier about Bill McKibben kind of becoming known for this question somebody asked him many times. Well, what can I do, as just an individual here, that it's not going to make any difference. And his response is almost always, well, the first thing you can do is stop being an individual. You need to connect with other people who are on about these same yearnings, these same desires for healing, and that is how this change will be
Hmm.
affected. So it's basically saying, stop being in the separation myth, asking what I can do from here, my self-contained being do to make things better, and start linking with the people around. I think he's talking primarily about people. And in those connections, things would happen that could never happen with a bunch of individuals only acting on their own.
And so, in that, I think is the answer for humans to the question, how do we've completely concocted this separation thing, completely made it up that we're separate from the natural world. The evidence just isn't there for it, except, except from the egocentric experience of looking at your skin and saying, okay, this is me and that's you, and we are separate. And also then there's the developmental considerations that I won't go into, but we have to go through this experience of considering ourselves. Like Jacqueline was saying early on, her young adult children are needing to individuate. That is a thing that needs to happen for adults to become capable of adulting. That is, certainly in our culture. Um,
Yeah.
and so, but the question is, how do we remember who we are, even in our assertion of, in that case, sovereignty? Individuation is an assertion of sovereignty. I've got this life, I'm going to live it, you know,
Yeah.
here we go. And so it seems to me that the challenge is we can look to the soil because the soil reminds us of this complete interdependence. But in some ways, we can't because the soil doesn't have a frontal lobe. And that's a pretty annoying thing to have. It can be. And so that is the invitation. And I think, Danya, as you were speaking earlier, you described it as consciousness. with this capacity to be self-reflective, that is both our ticket back to remembering who we truly are. And it's also that ticket into, well, I don't need to be in relationship with anybody. I'm an individual. I'm a rugged individual. Yeah.
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 Yeah. And, we are meaning making species. We're a meaning making species, and we make meaning by virtue of the stories we tell. At least we became that. We evolved into that. And the stories we tell really are always, all stories are built around metaphors. What are the set of metaphors that
Mhm.
you're taking from the world within you and around you and using to build the stories that then, sustain the culture or help the culture evolve? And so that's a pretty tough thing to say. Okay, well, let's change our metaphors and thus change our stories. But however we need to do that, we need to do that.
Well, and the fact is, if you look at even, I don't know, I would have to take a look at a lot of social media that I see when I post on Instagram every day has its ground in the natural world. There's a lot of natural
Mm,
world presence.
mm,
So we have a lot of metaphors that
mm.
come from the natural world still.
Sure, yeah.
And so amping that up, that's a curious thing to be in discussion. I don't know if you would have the chance with the people who are gathering uh, for your talk, Dan. What are the metaphors that can come from what we know about plant life that that we can use inside our own thinking and perhaps share with others? Um,
That is a very good point. I have a list of questions I was going to ask people for prompting thought, and now I'm going to add that one. Thank you for that.
Good,
Okay, go
absolutely.
Oh,
ahead.
just quickly, you know, I thinking of changing metaphors between Peter Wollebein's The Hidden Life of Trees and then
Mm,
Suzanne Simard's brilliant work that she expounded on further in her own book, Finding the Mother Tree. I think we are starting to change that
mm,
metaphor from
mm.
I
competition
agree.
to facilitation. And,
Yeah,
people are using things like the wood wide web,
right,
rather than the
right.
World Wide Web for trying to get at that. So, I mean, I am encouraged in that sense that
Great.
we're starting to use different metaphors rather than just the struggle for existence.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. You're right. You're right. It does feel like there's significant movement in that direction.
And I'm just curious what happens, at the extent to which any of us would be aware of it because we're in the middle of it.
Mm,
But we're the
mm.
people in the Copernican revolution aware that their whole paradigm was shifting. It does feel like there are some shifts underway. And Jacqueline, I think what you're mentioning is a perfect example of, yeah, the stuff really is underway. That
Yeah, yeah.
we're having conversations that we weren't having 5 years ago. We are talking about, and just stay tuned. We'll just stay tuned.
Which makes me wonder if, as we change those stories and those metaphors to more real, reality based and useful, that's a kind of us acting out, maybe in service of a homeostasis ourselves. Because with those changes and by embracing those and moving in that direction, then perhaps we run a much higher chance of continuing on for the centuries to come without, uh, killing so many of us by virtue of having unraveled the planet.
Well, and this conversation and the shifting of metaphors, all of that can be understood as ritual and as giving back to the planet.
Hmm.
So we aren't dropping our leaves necessarily, but we are contributing to the energy that is part of this ineffable kind of process ineffable process in which we're all engaged.
That really brings a sacredness to each of our lives, that holding that sort of thought system. It's really very satisfying, deeply satisfying sense of place, sense of belonging, sense of purpose, sense of meaning. Um, it's really inspiring.
Yeah, there we are, because that's what we are. True nature is true nature.
Thank
Thank
you
you
both.
for being with us. Yes, it's great to see you and have a wonderful rest of your summer.